All right, well, good evening.
Hello.
Here we are. It's middle of September. It's hard to believe. And ready for a second session on this book that has caused so many people consternation and bewilderment, and others inspiration, and others all kinds of other reactions. If you weren't here last week, let me recap in about 2 or 3 minutes a couple of things. I started out by saying that this book has puzzled and mystified people for a couple of thousand years. Some have thought it doesn't even belong in the Bible, like Martin Luther, who thought it was too mysterious and difficult to understand to even try to put it in the Bible. He lost that battle. I think I mistakenly said last week he wanted 2 books out of the Bible, Revelation. I mistakenly said Hebrews. I meant to say James. That was the other book Martin Luther didn't really want in the Bible because he thought it was too much focusing on works instead of faith, and he was so strong behind Paul's emphasis on faith. But both books ended up in the Bible, including this last book of Revelation, and people have interpreted it in all kinds of ways across the different centuries. I mentioned last week that about 150 years ago, an interpretation of this book called dispensationalism came into being, first in England and then America, especially around the early part of the 20th century, the 1920s and 30s, during the time in which fundamentalism was on the rise in America. Many fundamentalist churches adopted this view of Revelation called dispensationalism, which divides all of human history into 7 periods called dispensations, and then creates a timeline for all of history from the beginning until the end of time based on that interpretation of Revelation. It is, in the view of most scholars, not a good way to interpret Revelation. It is not really sound biblical scholarship. It ignores a lot of the literary meanings in the book. But if you read a book like Left Behind or other popular books based on that theory, you'll think, well, that's the way people have always understood Revelation. Well, it's not. And so I'm going to try, starting last week and this week, to talk about the more, I guess you would say, scholarly understanding of the book of Revelation, which begins by simply understanding that Revelation is a particular kind of literature that is unique in not really a part of modern literature. Apocalyptic literature is written in a very stylized way, using a lot of vivid imagery. And if you've never read apocalyptic literature before, it comes across as just kind of wild and even crazy. It would be like someone who's never read science fiction before, or someone who's never read poetry before, or some other genre of literature. It would seem very strange to them. I'll conclude by just recapping for me the greatest insight of Dr. Bruce Metzger in his book about how to understand the book of Revelation, and he uses the analogy of a political cartoon. I remember saying, we see a picture of an elephant and a donkey pulling on a rope, and we immediately grasp the meaning of that cartoon. We know, oh, the donkey stands for the Democratic Party, and the elephant stands for the Republican Party, and this cartoon is a commentary on their struggle, and we immediately know what that imagery means because we kind of know the code. But if you were to show that cartoon to someone in the middle of Africa or some other place that wasn't familiar with American history or American politics, all they would see was a weird picture of an elephant and a donkey. They wouldn't grasp the meaning behind the picture. And that analogy works for Revelation. There's lots of pictures and imagery that to us seems odd and strange and even bizarre. But the more we know about the history, the more we know about the Old Testament, the more we know about what certain symbols stood for, the closer we can get to figuring out what the original author was trying to communicate. The last thing I'll reiterate is that most scholars like to emphasize that this book was written to a group of people in the first century. And when we try to figure out what is it saying, the first thing we have to think about is what did it mean to them? What did it mean to the people to whom it was addressed? What did it mean to first century Christians or Christians at the turn of the first century, or right around the year 90 to 100? How did they understand it? Because that's the primary audience. And trying to read it purely as a projection of what's going to happen in the future is not the primary way to read it. The primary way to read it is, what did it mean to the people to whom it was addressed? How did they understand it? So we started kind of with that preface. We looked at John's initial vision of Christ when he's there on the island of Patmos, a vision that's very different from the paintings of Jesus that we have. A Jesus with white hair and red eyes and a sword in his mouth. Not a very appealing picture of Jesus, frankly, a sort of frightening picture. But then, as we said, that picture of Jesus is not meant to be a literal resemblance of Jesus. It's a symbolic picture of Jesus. The sword in his mouth doesn't mean he literally has a sword in his mouth. It has to do with the power of his words. The red eyes don't mean he literally has red eyes. It has to do with his penetrating glance that burns away lies. That every feature of Jesus in that picture is symbolic, not literal. And that's going to be the way all through the book. We have to continually understand that this is symbolic language pointing to a deeper meaning. And the more we try to take some of these images literally, the more lost we'll get, and frankly, we'll be going down the wrong track. So we started, Jesus appears to John and says, here, communicate this message. And the first part of the message is a letter to 7 churches. 7 churches in what's called Asia, but not Asia the way we think about it, not Japan and China. Asia meaning the province of Asia, which was Turkey in Roman times. And the 7 towns or cities to which this letter is addressed are all in the western part of Turkey. They're all about 40 to 50 miles apart from each other. They form sort of a little circuit. And the idea would be that this letter would go to all 7 of these churches. They'd make a copy of it and take it to the next church. They'd make a copy of it and take it to the next church until all 7 churches had a copy of this letter. Making a copy is a big deal in those days. It all has to be done by hand. So for most people, they wouldn't be able to read this letter. They'd be able to hear someone else read the letter. And we got through the first letter. We got through Ephesus. And each letter has a formula to it. An introductive, this is the letter from, and then a description of Christ. From the one who sits or stands among the 7 stars, or for the one whose voice is like the mighty thunder. Each letter begins with an identification of Christ, and then it directs comments to the situation in that town. In Ephesus, to recap, the major thing was that Jesus says to the church at Ephesus, I know your hard work, I know your deeds, I know all these good things about you, I know you've endured hard things for me, but here's what I have against you. You have forsaken your first love. You don't have the kind of commitment and love for me that you had when you first started as a church. And we talked last week about how that church in Ephesus got started. How the book of Acts talks about Paul being in Ephesus. And how the city of Ephesus was well known as the home base for the great temple of Artemis. They were very proud of the goddess Artemis. And when you live as a Christian in a town that is well known for being the home base of a Roman Greek goddess, that doesn't make life easy. And we even look back at the book of Acts where Paul ran into trouble in Ephesus because they thought his preaching about Jesus was potentially diminishing the reputation of Artemis and might even stop the tourists from buying trinkets in celebration of Artemis. So that was Ephesus. But now let's dig into the next church, which is Smyrna. And that's where we left off last time. I started to try to get started with Smyrna, but we really ran out of time. So let's think about what was Smyrna. Smyrna was a large commercial city. It was known as being a very Roman city. I think I ended by saying the first temple in the world built to Roma, the goddess Roma, from which the city of Rome takes its name, was built in Smyrna about 300 years before this letter was written. About 70 years before this letter was written, they built a temple in Smyrna dedicated to Tiberius Caesar, to worship Caesar as a god. The letter to Smyrna is only 2 of the 7 letters are purely positive. In other words, they have no critique. Smyrna and Philadelphia are only positive in their comments. And for those who kind of know anything about early church history, most of us, we know from the Bible, we know the names of the apostles. We know the names from the book of Acts of some of the other early believers like Paul or Timothy or Barnabas or the 7 deacons like Philip. We know that first generation of Christian. We don't know as much, at least I didn't know anything about the next generation of Christians until I went to seminary. Because you think about it, the second and third generation of Christian, the church leaders at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century, one of the most famous bishops of the early church was from Smyrna, and his name was Polycarp. Polycarp, which is not, golly. Just like it sounds, Polycarp. And Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna in the 2nd century. In other words, right around the turn of the 1st century, around the year 100 and going forward. He was ordained as a bishop in the church at Smyrna by John the Apostle. So, in other words, this is somebody, you think about that connection that goes back to the apostles. Well, who's the generation right after that? The ones who actually knew the apostles. John, being the oldest of the apostles, well, really the youngest, but the longest lived of the apostles. John, the brother of James, son of Zebedee, John, one of the original 12, was the one who laid hands on Polycarp and ordained him as a bishop in the church. So that link that goes Jesus to the apostles to the next generation. And Polycarp was the bishop at Smyrna, and by bishop, remember the word bishop today means something, somebody who wears some fancy clothes, and depending on the denomination, looks very regal and might carry a shepherd's crook. And bishop, the word in the New Testament, episkopos, is the word in Greek, episkopos, which we get the word, what? Episcopal, is where the word episcopal comes from. The word episkopos in the New Testament, that's translated as bishop, just means elder or leader. So, like when Paul is writing to Timothy and he says bishops should be the qualification to be a bishop in the church. It's really his elder or leader. And so Polycarp was the leader of the church in Smyrna. He didn't have fancy clothes. He didn't wear a mitre, and he didn't look like what we think of as a bishop. But he was the leader, and he was the leader there for many decades. And he's known not only because of his writings, but he's known because of his martyrdom. Because when he was 86 years old, which in those days, the 2nd century is a pretty old. When he was 86 years old, he was brought up on charges of refusing to worship the emperor. Remember I talked about, by the time of the Emperor Domitian, which is when this letter of Revelation was written, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. Domitian had a law throughout the Roman Empire. Every person was required to worship the emperor as God. Now remember, the Jews had an exemption, but Christians by this time were not considered Jews, because most of them weren't. The Gentiles had overtaken the Jews as the majority of Christians. So the Christians were no longer given any kind of dispensation they were not. They were forced to obey the law of worshiping Caesar like everyone else. And of course the Christians refused to do that because the law said everyone, at least once a year, had to go to the temple, take a pinch of incense, throw it in the fire, and say, Caesar is Lord and God. Caesar is Lord and God. And the Christians would not say those words. They would not say Caesar is Lord and God. And Polycarp, this very respected old man in Smyrna, bishop, leader of the church there, was finally arrested and charged with atheism. Remember, that's what they called the Christians. They called the Christians the atheists because they did not worship the gods. since they didn't worship the gods, they called them the atheists. And so Polycarp, the Christian leader, was accused of being an atheist and was burned at the stake. And the story is that, when he, they tied him to the stake and were ready to set the fire, and they gave him one last chance to change his mind and curse Jesus and worship the emperor. And he said, for however many years since he was a boy, for 70 years, he's been my savior. He's never let me down. I wouldn't let him down, etc. And he would not do that, and was burned at the stake as a follower of Jesus at the age of 86. But Polycarp is of that next generation of Christian leaders that we don't often hear about. But there's a direct connection between Polycarp and John the Apostle, John the disciple. That's probably the other well-known thing about Smyrna. Notice there, he says to the people of Smyrna, verse 9, 2:9, this is Revelations 2:9, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you're rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Remember, John himself is Jewish, but apparently much of the persecution of Christians in Smyrna was coming not from Gentiles, but from Jews. That's why he refers to their synagogue as being a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you'll suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Now, when it says something like 10 days, remember, most times those things aren't to be taken literally either. When it talks about years or days or hours, almost always it's a symbolic time. It means like for a while or for a period of time. Let's talk about Pergamum. Pergamum, which is the next church. Pergamum is the capital of this province of Asia. Pergamum had a library that rivaled the Library of Alexandria, which is well known. But probably the most famous, again, landmark of Pergamum was a temple of Zeus. There was a temple of Zeus in Pergamum, and it was huge. It was a giant structure. And what sat in the middle of the temple was a giant throne. A giant throne sat in the middle of the temple, which was supposed to be the throne of Zeus. So again, people would come to Pergamum to worship Zeus. And because Zeus, if you remember your Greek mythology, remember Zeus is the king of the gods. Zeus is the father of the gods. And so there in Pergamum, there were animal sacrifices being made to Zeus 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you were walking through Pergamum, you would smell animal flesh burning because it was continual animal sacrifice around the clock every day, all day long. Think about this huge temple, and inside is a throne that is meant to resemble or be the throne of Zeus, the king of the gods. Now, there was another temple there in Pergamum that was a temple to Asclepius. You know who that god is the god of, depending on your profession? Doctors or nurses?
What's the name of it again?
Asclepius. Any doctors or nurses? That is the Greek god of healing. What was his symbol?
Snake.
A staff with what? A snake. Why? Why? Medical folks, why is it a staff with a snake? Anybody know? At the temple of Asclepius, there were sacred snakes. And people were brought there so that they might be bitten by the sacred snakes and healed. But as we say, that Greek god of Asclepius and the temple of the snakes still comes down into modern medicine as the symbol, the physician's symbol of the staff with the snake.
How do you spell that? Asclepius.
It's just like it sounds, Asclepius. So, again, to live in Pergamum was not easy for a Christian. Look at what Christ writes to the church at Pergamum. These are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. Remember this, the sword in his mouth. I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. Okay, so now see, where Satan has his throne. Now, what I just told you about the historical background of this town and the fact that there's a temple of Zeus there that has a giant throne in the middle of it. Now, because I've given you that historical background, a phrase of this letter makes sense to you, right? Because there's a throne there in a temple, the throne of Zeus, that now is called the throne of Satan.
And John says, I mean, he's writing this to them because Jesus came and said this to him in a vision.
Right, because John has a vision, and it's like, write this to the 7 churches. Write this to Ephesus. Write this to Smyrna. Write this to Pergamum. It says, I know where you live. You live where Satan has his throne. Yet you remain true to my name. You didn't renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. Again, where Satan lives is because this is the home base of the king of the false gods. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and committing sexual immorality. Now, if you remember, again, this is a reference. Balaam is an Old Testament figure. So again, the odds are this is not literally referring to somebody named Balaam. This is referring to a controversy there, and he's using the name of Balaam as a reference back to an Old Testament story as to a person in the Old Testament who tried to entice the Israelites into sin. This is the same way that every time the letter references the Roman Empire, it never says the Roman Empire. What does it say in this letter? What is the word used to reference the Roman Empire? Babylon. Every time John references the Roman Empire, he doesn't call it the Roman Empire, he calls it Babylon. Because, again, it's referencing back to that enemy of Israel who destroyed them, who destroyed their temple, who brought them into slavery, who persecuted them, who killed them. This letter is written in a kind of code for a variety of reasons. One is to connect it to the Old Testament. The other is that if somebody's caught with this letter, instead of saying Rome, which somebody reads that and it's immediate cause for treason and death and arrest, every time he means Rome, he says Babylon. Okay? So that's when we talk about a code. When it was, like many other things, it's written in a language that everyone who received it would understand exactly what he's talking about. Like here, the throne of Satan. Well, why didn't you just say the throne of Zeus? Well, because this is being written to a persecuted people, and you write in a way that they know what you're talking about, but that somebody, a casual reader who's not a Christian, would not understand it. So, Balaam is, again, probably not literally somebody named Balaam. It's somebody who is enticing the church into sin, just like Balaam and his, remember Balaam, he's the one with the talking donkey back in the Old Testament? Balaam enticed Israel into sin. Well, this is somebody there in Pergamum who's enticing them into sin. And he says, entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and committing sexual immorality. Well, those probably are the sins that someone is enticing the Christians in Pergamum to participate in. Because remember, this is one of those issues that was a huge issue for the New Testament Christian, and it seems like a strange issue for us, but a huge issue was food. What can you eat as a Christian? And specifically, if I'm going to go worship Zeus, okay, not really, but I'm a Zeus worshiper. And remember, they sacrificed animals to Zeus 24/7. Well, they didn't burn up the whole animal. There's different kinds of offerings. There's the offering where you literally burn up the entire animal. In fact, you know what the Old Testament word is for an offering where you burn up the whole animal? What it's called? It's called a holocaust.
Wow, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Which again, you make connections. Why is something called what it's called? Why is the Holocaust called what it's called? It's because it was the burning up of people.
Total annihilation.
Total annihilation. But not all burnt offerings are Holocaust offerings. Some of them, they would take just a portion of the animal and burn it on an altar. This is true both in the Jewish temple and in pagan temples, both. They burn just a portion of the animal, and then the rest of the animal would be used to either pay the priest, pay him in livestock or in meat, or if you're a priest, and this happened again both in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and in pagan temples as well. I'm a priest, and a person has brought a calf or a goat or whatever to offer to either the real God in the real temple or a false god in a pagan temple. And I've burned a representative portion of the meat on the altar. Now I got a whole side of beef here. Well, I got, a family. I can't eat a whole side of beef before it goes bad in a world without refrigeration and et cetera, et cetera. So what do I do with it? Well, I sell it. And so the temple was the temple/butcher shop. It was the temple/meat market. So I want to buy meat for a feast or a meal. Where am I going to go buy meat? Well, I'm going to go to the nearest temple to buy meat. That's where I could buy meat from a priest. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, what it has to do with is, okay, now I'm a Christian. Okay? I'm a Christian. And I've got neighbors who aren't Christians, but I'm trying to be, I'm trying to be a witness. I'm trying to invite them to come to know Jesus. I'm reaching out to my neighbors with the good news. I go to my neighbor's house, who's a pagan, and they have a meal. And the meal is pot roast. But where did the pot roast come from? It came from the temple of Zeus. Okay? Can I, as a Christian, eat the meat that was used to sacrifice to a false god?
Is that meat from the same animal that meat was, it
Yes.
was literally sacrificed?
Right. They literally sacrificed a part of the animal on the temple of Zeus, and the rest of the animal the priest sold to the public. All right?
Yeah.
So, this is meat that was part of a pagan sacrifice. And now it's on the dinner table. Can I, as a Christian, partake of that meal? Well, if you read the book of Acts, this is a huge issue for the Christians. It's an issue that Paul spends chapter after chapter discussing in his letters. It's the issue that the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts meets to try to decide what is the appropriate answer to this question. And if you remember, Christians are not of one mind about this. If you remember, Paul's position is eat what's put in front of you and don't ask questions. That's Paul's position. Somebody serves you meat, don't ask any questions, just eat it. That's Paul's position. Other, more strict Jewish Christians said, no, you can't eat it. So this is a live question among Christians in the first century. Can you eat food that was used in a pagan worship service? So As I say, if you go back to the Jerusalem Council, matter of fact, let's go back there just for a minute. Acts 15. They come to Jerusalem in chapter 15 of the book of Acts, and they say, what's the answer to this? Matter of fact, I'm even going to talk about this in the sermon in a few weeks. And they have a big debate about it, and one side says, no, Christians can't eat this food. And the other side says, no, there is no Zeus, there is no Apollo, there is no Artemis, these gods don't exist. These so-called Greek and Roman gods are not real gods at all. They're made up. So who cares where the food came from? That's the debate. And here's what the Jerusalem Council says, their decision. Acts 15, starting in verse 24. Here's the letter they send out to the Gentile Christians. Acts 15:24. We've heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you, troubling your minds by what they said. So we all agreed to choose some men and send them to you with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, we're sending Judas and Silas to confirm by word of mouth what we're writing. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. You're to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You'll do well to avoid these things. Farewell. That's their, in other words, and part of that is like, you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to obey all the other kosher laws. You know, you can eat pork. They were saying you can do all these things, but they still said you shouldn't eat the meat that's been sacrificed to idols. Paul takes a different position. As I say, Paul's position is, don't just eat it. Don't even ask questions. Just whatever, don't ask where it came from. Just eat it. But this is a live issue, and you can see in these letters, it's still a live issue. But the other issue is not only about what food is it okay to eat, it's sexual immorality. Because remember, in the Gentile world, it is very common for a very noble, respected man in the Gentile world to have a wife and a mistress and to go to the brothel. And there was no stigma attached to that. That was what you did. You had a wife, so you could have legitimate children, but you might have nothing in common with her, so you might have a mistress also. And men also would just go to the brothel, which was often not only for sex, but also many of the brothels were connected to temples. And they were part of the worship of a god. The way you worship the god was by sleeping by the priestess of the god. So, if you're a first generation Christian, and you've been raised in a culture where the brothel is just a part of normal everyday life, and suddenly you're being told, no, you have to just have one wife and be faithful to her, and there's no brothel, there's no mistresses, it's just the one wife. That's a change in culture.
Make it make sense.
Because, thankfully, I was going to say we used to live in a Christian culture. We really don't anymore. We used to live in a Christian culture where it was taken for granted that, celibacy and singleness and faithfulness and marriage is the standard by which we live. That's not the case anymore. Our culture doesn't have that standard anymore. But we wish it did, but it doesn't. But the Christian standard is a different standard for the Gentiles. So Jesus is saying to Pergamum, to the people in Pergamum, I know it's tough to live there. It's tough to live in a city where pagan worship is so prevalent and to stay faithful to that. So let's talk about Thyatira. Thyatira is a little bit longer letter. Let's read it first. Here are the words. This is Thyatira, is Revelation 2:18. These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. Again, both of these are referencing back to the description of Jesus back in the first chapter. I know your deeds, your love, your faith, your service, and your perseverance, and that you're now doing more than you did at first. That's all good. Okay. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman, Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. Now, is her name really Jezebel? Probably not. Who was Jezebel? Ahab's wife. Who was Ahab? He was one of the kings of Israel who got into a tussle with what prophet? Elijah. Remember Elijah? Remember, Elijah is the one who Ahab had married Jezebel, who was a princess from a pagan country. She brought all of her priests of Baal or Baal with her to Israel. And Israel started worshiping false gods, and Elijah was prophesying against that. And remember, Elijah calls for them to have a big contest. Remember?
The fire.
The fire.
Yeah. Have Baal
Make
start the fire.
two altars. You guys pray to Baal to send fire. I'll pray to Yahweh to send fire. We'll see which God is real. Remember, and priests of Baal, they screamed and cried and cut themselves and danced around and did all this stuff. And Elijah was heckling them from the sidelines. And there's no fire. And then Elijah prays, and there's fire and consumes the sacrifice. And he orders the people to kill the prophets of Baal. Well, that makes Jezebel so furious that she swears that she's going to make sure Elijah's dead. That's that whole story back about Elijah. Well, so here he calls this woman Jezebel. Again, after that episode, nobody's going to name their little girl Jezebel. Okay? So again, this is referring to her by a name that's not her real name. How many little boys today are named Adolf?
Yeah.
There's some names that you just don't use. She calls herself a prophetess. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. Same two issues. Food and sexual practice. I've given her time to repent of her immorality, but she's unwilling. So I'll cast her on a bed of suffering. I'll make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely unless they repent of her ways. I'll strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am the one who searches hearts and minds. I'll repay each of you according to your deeds. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose any other burden on you. Only hold on to what you have until I come. To him who overcomes and does my will to the end, I'll give authority over the nations. He'll rule them with an iron scepter. He'll dash them to pieces like pottery. That's a quote, by the way, from Psalm 2:9. Verse 27 is a quote from Psalm 2:9. Just as I have received authority from my Father, I will also give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So again, what do we know? Well, we don't know everything about this, but we know apparently there was a woman in the church at Thyatira who said she had deep secrets. In other words, there were always people, then and now, that say, well, you know Christianity, but let me tell you like the deep hidden secret part. Let me now tell you the part that only the elite can know, that only the mature can know, that only, we see this, unfortunately, throughout history, in Christianity and other religions, this idea of you go deeper and deeper, and the deeper you go, then you get to know the secret stuff, or the deep knowledge. This is true in Masonic organizations. It's true in things like Mormonism, Latter-day Saints, as you go through the different levels of knowledge. It's true in Scientology. It's true in a lot of groups that there's people who always say, well, but let me tell you about the real deep stuff. And, there have always been, unfortunately, in Christianity, people who try to say, well, we're the elite, we know more, we know the deeper stuff. And he's saying this woman and her so-called deep secrets, which he calls secrets of Satan. He's like, her deep secrets are probably are totally wrong, because she is saying, she's compromising stands, especially on sexual immorality. Now, as I said, the thing that we separate, we don't associate worship with eating food usually. I mean, we have communion, but I mean, we don't draw that many connections to what you eat is a religious thing. I mean, Judaism, of course, the kosher laws are a deep part of Judaism. But for most of us, what we eat is not a religious decision. What our sexual practices are tied to our faith, hopefully. But most of us have, when I say in the ancient world, in the pagan world, how do you worship a god? Well, you sleep with a sacred prostitute. We just go, what? The idea that you would worship with sex seems very strange to us.
Is that what you're calling Jezebel?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Because if I'm going to worship at the temple of Athena or Aphrodite or Artemis or some of these other gods and goddesses, well, some of these gods and goddesses are gods and goddesses of fertility. And this is true not of Greek and Roman gods, it's true of gods like Baal and some of these other false gods that we hear about in the Old Testament. How do you worship the fertility god? Well, you do it by sleeping with a sacred prostitute.
Good salesmanship.
Well, you say, how do the Israelites keep falling into sin, worshiping these false gods? Well, the way you worship Yahweh is you bring an animal to his temple. The way you worship Baal is to sleep with a prostitute. So which one would be enticing to fall away from one style of worship to the other style of worship? The other thing, in this country, it's not as powerful as it was 20 or 30 years ago, but we have trade unions, right? We have unions from different kinds of, steel workers and plumbers and, longshoremen and electricians and et cetera. We have unions. Well, they had trade unions in the ancient world too. Woodworkers, metal workers, et cetera, especially in cities. Okay, I'm a member of a trade guild. I'm a member of the silversmith guild. Okay? And we're going to have our monthly meeting. Well, where are we going to meet? Well, we're going to meet at the Temple of Diana. And we're going to have a feast there of meat from the temple butcher shop. So I'm a Christian silversmith. I need work. So I need to be a part of the trade union. But the trade union has a god that is their patron god, and they meet at the temple and have feasts and celebrate and worship that god as a part of their trade union. So what do you as a Christian do? If you're a Christian silversmith or a Christian woodworker or a Christian whatever, you've got to feed your family, you've got to find work, you've got to be a part of the union, but being a part of the union means you worship a pagan god. So what do you do?
Pretend.
Hard question. Yeah, hard decision.
Yeah. Say, well, why was it so hard to be a Christian?
Yeah.
Well, this is part of the reason, because you to be in the society and yet not to partake of all these things in the society was, it's a question that's still around today. How much do you conform to the world? How much do you conform to the culture as a Christian? I've told the story I think before, but when I think about, you don't have to worship a phony god or a false god to be a member of a union today. We don't have these issues, say at the grocery store. But 2 churches back, when I was a pastor in Oklahoma City, I had a man in my church who was in sales, and his boss said to him, "We got these guys coming in from out of town. I want you to take them to the strip club." And he said, I'm not comfortable doing that. I'm not comfortable taking these clients to the strip club. His boss said, well, that's where they want to go, and you are the salesman for them, and you need to take them to the strip club. And he was faced with that decision, and he quit his job. He quit his job rather than compromise his morals and his faith. And when he told me that on Sunday morning, what he had done, I was very proud of him.
Yeah.
I was worried about it because he lost his job, but it came to that place of, here's my job and here's my faith, and what am I going to do when these two things clash? So that is now Sardis. These are the words of him who holds the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you're dead. Wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your deeds complete in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you've received and heard. Obey it and repent. If you don't wake up, I'll come like a thief, and you'll not know at what time I'm coming to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who haven't soiled their clothes. They walk with me dressed in white. They're worthy. He who overcomes will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out his name from the book of life, but will acknowledge his name before my Father and his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Sardis, at one point, was one of the great cities of the world. It had been conquered twice and destroyed. It had been destroyed another time by an earthquake. So Sardis, by the first century, was not the city that it once was. But notice what Christ says to the church at Sardis: they're dead. They are a dead church. He says, you better wake up. You have a reputation of being alive, but you're actually dead. Now he said, no, there are a few people there who haven't soiled their clothes and are dressed in white. Now again, is he talking literally about whether they've gotten fallen in the mud and what color their robes are? No, none of this is literal. A white robe is a sign of purity. Okay? So he's not talking about literally the color of their outfit. He's talking about whether or not they have participated in activities to soil their spirit. But he's saying, again, metaphorically, some of you haven't soiled your clothes. So some of you have not gotten involved in these activities that are abhorrent to Christ. And notice this idea of the book of life, which is going to come up a few other times. I will not blot out his name from the book of life. Most cities in the Roman world had a book. Now I say a book, it's a scroll actually, okay? Because books like we think of haven't been invented yet. But a scroll. And on that scroll, they listed the name of every citizen of the town. Okay? Like the city records. If someone committed a crime or brought dishonor on the town, guess what they would do?
Write their name down.
No, they take their name out of the book.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Post somewhere else.
Yeah. Their name would be blotted out. Their name would be removed from the list of citizens of the town. They would do this, like, this person is a criminal, or this person has brought dishonor on our town. We're taking his name out of the book of our town. Well, so again, this is the analogy, the idea of, you'll see all through the book of Revelation, this idea of in eternity there being a book, and the names of the saints, the names of God's people are in this book, the book of life. And it talks about, is your name in the book, or is your name blotted out of the book? Now, again, are we talking about a literal book here? No, we're not talking about a literal book.
You're talking about something that's heavenly or You're not talking about something that the people can.
Well, I am talking about a literal scroll in a literal city. They did literally have a scroll with the names of the citizens on
But
it.
the book of life and the references is.
Right. When I'm talking,
something more-
when they talk about the book of life,
Spiritual.
it's a metaphorical way of talking about those who are saved, those who are Christians.
They
doesn't
would
mean-
pass it to gay.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean there's literally a literal book with literal pages, with literal ink, gold or otherwise. You know, I mean, that.
Well, and people aren't involved in determining who's on it.
No, only God knows which.
Yeah.
But I'm saying is when you talk about whose name is on the is in the book of life, again, it's a metaphorical way of talking about those people who are saved, those people who are Christians. Most of the things that we're going to talk about when it talks about heaven, or when it talks about hell, or when it talks about angel, almost everything that we read in this book, we're going to have to say, we're not taking this literally. We're not, because if you start taking it literally, you come up with this weird picture of something that's grotesque. You have to realize that, just like, well, okay, is Hillary Clinton a donkey and is Donald Trump an elephant? No. He is not a literal elephant. She is not a literal donkey. These are symbolic ways of talking about things that were not to be taken literally. Yeah.
Larry, the previous churches that we've talked about had pagan temples, idols, you name it. And I would have thought those would have been lifeless. But here, they're talking about a lifeless church, but they don't give a specific reason why it's lifeless. Do they have more pagan idols here in this city, or what?
I think we're not given how it is they become dead, other than, in several of these churches, like the very first one, Ephesus, it says you used to have this passionate love, and now you've lost it.
Well, we know it's been destroyed 3 times.
Yeah. Well, the city's been destroyed 3
The
times.
city has, but
Yeah.
how has it grown back each
Right.
time?
Sometimes the federal government in Rome would give them aid, and sometimes the wealthy citizens would pitch in. But unfortunately, there are dead churches today.
The Presbyterian one over here proposed.
When you say a church is dead, it doesn't always literally mean that they've locked the doors and boarded up the windows. But there are churches that they no longer have any fervor for Christ. They no longer have any desire to reach anyone. They no longer have any desire to serve anyone. They just are going through the motions. They're just, unfortunately, there are churches that we would describe today as dead, or so near death that, they're on fumes, we might say, or they're, and I don't know anything about the Presbyterian church across the street. I know that, it's not very active. I don't know
No,
much
it's
beyond
closed.
that. Oh, is it finally actually
And
closed?
let the preacher go. The preacher's wife is my beauty operator.
So it's
They were
closed
down to
now.
like 12 to 15 parishioners.
And they were probably all elderly.
No children in the church.
Yeah, I've said before, there's 500 Methodist churches in Oklahoma. Half of them have no children. No one under 18 in the churches. Half of them. Nobody under 18. Not a single person. 250 of them.
And that's why we tithe, for the children's program.
Then let's get to the last two, Philadelphia and Laodicea. Okay? Like Philadelphia, finally a name we can pronounce, right? Like all of a sudden you're like, way over in Pennsylvania? No, not that Philadelphia. And of course, just the word Philadelphia, Philios means love. It's one of the 4 words in Greek for love, Philios. Adelphos is Greek for brother. So Philadelphos means love of brother. So that's why they refer to Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love. Because the word Philadelphia literally means love of brother. So here's what, and here's what Jesus says to Philadelphia. These are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut. What he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you've kept my word and have not denied my name. I'll make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars, I'll make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I've loved you. Since you've kept my command to endure patiently, I'll also keep you from the hour of trial that's going to come upon the whole world to test those who live on the earth. I'm coming soon. Hold on to what you have, so that no one will take your crown. Him who overcomes, I'll make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will he leave it. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. I'll also write on him a new name, my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear. Now, Philadelphia, the church there is apparently small and poor. Again, this reference to synagogue of Satan, the Jews of the town are persecuting the Christians. But he praises them. There's no negative in this one. It's one of the other church where there's only positive. He says, you've hung on. I know you have little strength, but you've kept my word. You haven't denied me. He says, just hold on. Now notice again when I say you can't, you're going to find imagery in here where one image seems to be different from another image of the same thing. Like for example, he says in verse 12, him who overcomes, I'll make a pillar in the temple of my God. Okay. We're going to get over to the end of Revelation, and you know what it's going to say? It's going to say in heaven, it says, there is no temple. It says, because God is everywhere. There's no need for a temple. It says, because God's presence is everywhere. So, if we're taking this literally, you might say, no, wait a minute. Over here in chapter 3, it says there'll be a pillar in the temple, but over in chapter 20, it says there is no temple in heaven. So, which one is it? Well, that's the kind of thinking that shows that you don't get the kind of literature we're talking about. This literature is symbolic pictures. And each picture is unique unto itself. And this, well, we're going to see here in a minute, not to jump ahead of myself, but the way Jesus is described, white hair, red eyes, feet of bronze, and all that. In another picture of Jesus, he's described completely differently. Okay? You say, well, no, wait a minute, I thought he had feet of bronze and white hair. No, you're missing the point that each image is unique unto itself and is a symbolic image, not a literal image. This isn't what a photograph of Jesus would look like. This is a symbolic image. Just like last week when I read from the book of Song of Solomon, and it says your hair is like a flock of goats, and and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't mean her hair literally looks like a flock of goats. It doesn't literally mean her breasts look like two fawns. It's a symbolic language, and you have to understand not to take it in what Dr. Messer always calls wooden literalism. We can't read it with wooden literalism. The last church is the one that often, we hear about maybe the most of any of the seven, Laodicea. Here's what is written to the words of the people in Laodicea. These are the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the ruler of God's creation. I know your deeds, and you're neither hot nor cold. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you're lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. You say, I'm rich. I've acquired wealth and do not need a thing. But you don't realize that you're wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so you can become rich, and white clothes to wear, so you can cover your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes, so you can see. Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest and repent. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and eat with him, and he with me. To him who overcomes, I'll give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. Laodicea is a very wealthy city. I talked about it was also destroyed by an earthquake back in 61 AD. And just like now what we would call the federal government, in other words, the government in Rome said, well, we'll help rebuild Laodicea. And the leading citizens of Laodicea says, we don't need your help. We got it. They were so wealthy, they just rebuilt the city without any help. This is a wealthy city. And a very proud city. Matter of fact, Paul mentions Laodicea in one of his letters, in Colossians 2:1. If you want to go back to Paul's letter to the Colossians, the 2nd chapter. See, Laodicea is not very far from Colossia, the place where the Colossians live. You look at Colossians 2:1, Paul says, I want you to know how much I am struggling for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all who have not met me personally. My purpose is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, you may have full understanding of the riches, and in order that you may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, etc., etc., etc. So Paul mentions Laodicea to the Colossians. But notice this letter is the most severe of all the letters because there's no praise at all. Every other letter has at least something positive. There's nothing positive in this letter about Laodicea. It's all negative. And that phrase that phrase about being lukewarm. I wish you were either hot or cold. I always think about milk. Like cold milk is really good, and warm milk, like hot chocolate, is really good. But lukewarm milk is like, bleh, and that's right. He's like, if you were, it's almost like if you were really on the wrong track, at least you could maybe be turned around. But you're just, you're not doing anything. You're just blah. And unfortunately, just as I could say today, we could point to some churches that we would say are dead or near dead. We could also point to some churches that the description of lukewarm would be a pretty accurate, unfortunately, description. And here's the thing. He says, you think you got it going on. You think you say, I'm rich. I mean, because you picture a church where they got a big fancy building, and all, a nice facility or something, and yet there's nothing happening there. I mean, he says, you think you're rich, but really you're poor. You think you got it all going on, but really you're blind and naked and wretched. He says, and then that verse, behold, I stand at the door and knock. This is probably from the verses from Revelation. This is probably one of the best known verses in the book of Revelation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone will open the door, I'll come in. And you've seen the famous painting, right? We don't have any. You know what painting I'm talking about? Yeah. It's a door, and Jesus is standing at the door. And I think I pointed this out before. What's unique about that door? There's no doorknob on the outside. In that painting, there is no doorknob on the outside of the door. The door can't be opened from the outside. It can only be opened from the inside. So when Jesus knocks on the door of our hearts, we have to open it. He doesn't open it. He doesn't bust the door down. He doesn't push his way in. He knocks, but we have to open the door. And, week after week, you say, there are people, talking about church, there are people who go to church their whole lives and have never opened the door. Yeah. Because, going to church doesn't make you a Christian. Sitting in a pew doesn't make you a Christian any more than sitting in the garage makes you a car. So these are the letters to the 7 churches. Now it's almost like okay, frankly, this is the easy part. I mean, some of the words are, but in terms of understanding the symbolism, this is fairly easy to understand. Again, once you start like the throne of Satan. Okay, well, once we know the temple of Zeus is there. It looks like a big throne. I mean, some of these things, and the symbolism of Jesus, like the red eyes or the sword in the mouth or the white hair, fairly straightforward way to understand what that means, how we're to understand that symbolism. Now we start to get into a little more deeper waters. So chapter 4. So after the 7 churches, John has this vision. After I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And this voice I first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here and I'll show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. Before the throne 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God. Also before the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. In the center, around the throne, were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes, in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a face like a man. The fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings, and was covered with eyes all around, even under the wings. Day and night they never stopped saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." Whenever the living creatures gave glory, honor, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne and say, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." So, easy as pie, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious. I don't even need to do it. That's pretty simple there. No, all right. So here we have John, a vision of heaven, a vision of the throne of God. Okay, so John says in his spirit, it's like he's transported to heaven, and he has this vision of God and vision of the throne of God. Well, how do you describe that? How can you describe the throne of God? How can you describe the presence of God? Well, like, only by analogy, and only with symbolic language. Now notice, he's describing, he says the one sitting on the throne is God. Does he give you a description of God? Does he say, well, he's about 6'2", he's got brown hair, he's got brown eyes, he's got a beard, he's wearing, does he give you a description of God? No.
On the throne, right?
He says the one sitting on the throne, but he doesn't describe God. Because for the Jew, remember, even to try to make a visual representation of God is something that was an idol. They didn't do that. Yeah, Larry.
So, is it a vision that he had when he drifted off, or is this a vision that was sent to him from God?
Well, I think God is definitely inspiring this vision, but I think he is there on the island of Patmos, and he has this vision. And he sees something that is incredibly difficult to describe in human language. And he uses human language as best he can to describe the indescribable. But, it's a vision that is full of symbolism. It's not I don't think, I don't know, but I'm not sure if when we go to heaven, that this is what it will look like. I don't necessarily think this is meant to be a visual, realistic description of heaven. I think it is a symbolic description of heaven. And the same, we're going to get later. I don't necessarily think that heaven is paved with gold. Even though in one of the descriptions of heaven, says that the streets are made of gold. You know, gold is a physical metal substance on the earth. Is that physical metal substance going to be a part of eternity? I kind of doubt it. Are the gates of heaven actually going to be carved out of ginormous pearls? You know, maybe, but I don't think necessarily those descriptions are meant to be taken literally. They're using language, and that's why when it describes God, it doesn't say he's about 6'4", and I mean, it says the one on the throne resembled the appearance of jasper and carnelian. Okay, what does God look like? Well, he looks like jasper and carnelian. Well, what is jasper and carnelian? Well, they're both precious stones. Okay, jasper is a stone, is a precious stone that when you polish it, it's sort of clear and sparkly. And carnelian is a stone that is red, and when it sparkles, it looks kind of like it has fire inside of it. So, the closest he comes to describing what God looks like is the way that precious stones look when they sparkle and shine. You know, so again, well, okay, so God looks like stones, like, you know, gems. No, I don't think God looks like stones or gems. I think, again, it's trying to use a language. You know, I mean, in movies, sometimes when they are portraying God, it's just light, you know, it's like brilliant light or some other way. This is the same kind of thing. They're trying to find an image to describe that which is indescribable, and which to try to describe is almost blasphemous. Rather, it focuses on what's surrounding his throne. And a rainbow, you're like, okay, that makes sense, because a rainbow reminds us of what?
God's promise.
God's promise, specifically following the flood. God's mercy, God's promise to never destroy. But at the same time, it says, and the rainbow was like emerald. And you're like, no, wait a minute. Rainbows are all multicolored. They're not just green, you know. And again, that's our way of trying to be too literalistic about it. And instead of letting our imagination say, the symbolism of a rainbow, and then this emerald color, which is, you know, green and a warm color, a color that is, you know, as opposed red is a very sort of fiery color. Green is a much more, I guess you might say, merciful kind of color or warm color.
Color of life.
Yeah, and yeah, life, growing things. So the imagery is all meant to represent things. I mean, the idea of the carnelian, this red rock that kind of has a fiery glow to it, or the clear jasper that has more maybe a holiness idea to it. All of these are just images that are trying to describe the indescribable. Then there's these 24 elders. You know, it says that sitting around the throne, 24 elders. And you might say, well, okay, why 24? What would that number possibly mean? Why 24? Why not 22? Why not 27? Right? 12 tribes, 12 disciples. Old Testament, the 12 tribes. New Testament, the 12 apostles. You put 12 and 12 together and you get 24.
Well, why would they have Judas, the traitor, as the 12th?
Well, remember in the book of Acts, they replaced Judas. They replaced him with Matthias in the beginning of the book of Acts. But 12 is remember, there's numbers all through the Bible that we kept coming back to over and over again. We keep coming back to 7, keep coming back to 12, keep coming back to 40, keep coming back to 3 and 4, and 3 and 4 together are making 7. And these are numbers that are repeated all through the scriptures over and over and over again. And they always, you know, anytime you see 12, you naturally think, yeah, either tribes or apostles. You think of those numbers and you put the two together, and that's probably where you get to 24. The thunder and lightning, if you remember in the book of Exodus, when they get to Mount Sinai and Moses is climbing up to get the 10 Commandments, remember up at the top of the mountain there's thunder and lightning where God's presence is. There's this, it says that like a sea of glass, a crystal sea of glass that probably again, forms a kind of a separation between the throne and those who want to get close to it. But it's the four living creatures that really throw us here, okay? Because this starts to get really weird, okay? Because, one, they're covered with eyes. Now, again, like we can be literal and we can picture something out of a creepy movie, like with, you know. Or we can take the approach that's a little better approach. What, if a creature is covered with eyes, what is that trying to tell us?
All seeing.
All seeing. That's right. All seeing. It doesn't mean something weird and creepy. It means they see in every direction. They're all seeing. Now,
That's why I asked, is it him drifting off or an image from God? I mean, this is more and more like it's him drifting off. And
well, I mean, think of the word a vision, okay? A vision is kind of like a dream. I mean, dreams and visions. It's when back in the Old Testament, there are many places where people have visions. In the New Testament, you know, Peter has a vision. Peter has a vision of a blanket full of unclean animals coming down from heaven. And God says, why don't you eat one? And he's like, oh no, Lord, I'm not going to eat those pigs. And God says, well, I made the pigs. Go ahead and have a ham sandwich. And it's a vision. It says Peter was drifting and dreaming, sleeping on the roof, and God gave him a vision. So the line between vision and dream is probably a fairly narrow place, somewhere between vision and dream. But, you know, think about all the way back to Genesis, when Pharaoh has these dreams, and only Joseph can interpret what they mean. They mean 7 years of great crops followed by 7 years of famine. So the idea of God revealing himself in dreams and visions is kind of all through the Bible.
I just think of it in that all visions are dreams, but not all dreams are visions.
That's true. And I think this is definitely a vision. This is not just him having indigestion and having a weird dream. This is God speaking to him through a vision. God speaking to him through a vision that is hard for us to sometimes get a handle on. But the eyes are not even, okay, because you say, okay, eyes, that means all seeing. But then this other part, you know, one of them looks like a lion, one of them looks like an ox, one of them looks like a man, one of them looks like an eagle. Well, again, in the ancient world, certain things were taken for granted. What is the greatest and most noble of all the wild beasts? The lion. What is the strongest of all the domestic animals?
Elephant.
Yeah, and not in Israel. What is the swiftest of the birds? The eagle. What is the wisest of all creatures? Man. So you have these four representations of God's creatures. The lion is the most noble and regal. The ox is the strongest. The eagle is the swiftest. The human is the wisest. And so the four creatures are representing all the superlatives of creation. And this vision has a lot in common with some other visions. Like, for example, look over at Isaiah chapter 6. Go back to Isaiah chapter 6. Remember how I said there's hundreds of references to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation?
6:1.
6:1. Okay. Isaiah 6:1. Look what Isaiah says there. Talk about a vision. Isaiah 6:1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I meaning Isaiah, saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted. The King James says, high and lifted up. If you remember that language. I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, with 2 they were flying. They were calling to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried. "I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." One of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." I heard the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I. Send me." So, what does he call these beings? The seraphs. The seraphs. Actually, in Hebrew, the seraphim. Okay? Now look over at Ezekiel chapter 1. I don't have time to read all of Ezekiel chapter 1. We'll read a few bits of it here. Ezekiel 1. Ezekiel 1:1. Now Ezekiel, remember, is delivering a message to the exiles in Babylon. That's who Ezekiel is talking to. Okay, the people of Israel who've been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And here's what Ezekiel, the message he gets: "In the 30th year, the 4th month, of the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was upon him. I looked," this is Ezekiel talking, "and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like a glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under the wings and on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They didn't turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox, and on each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward, and each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on the other side, and 2 wings covered its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite. All 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel, intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they'd go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels didn't turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around." Okay, that sound familiar?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the same animals.
Well, not quite though. These all have 4 faces. The other one, one looked like a man, one looked like an ox, one looked like an eagle, one looked like... But each one of these has 4 faces. A man face, an eagle face, an ox face, a lion face. And, the descriptions are different. And then we go over and say, well, what are these creatures? And we go over to Ezekiel chapter 10, like 10:15. It says, "Then the cherubim rose upward. These were the living creatures I had seen by the Kebar River." Okay, so these creatures are called, in English we would say cherubs, but in Hebrew it's cherubim. Okay. Seraphim and cherubim. These are angels. Okay. Seraphim and cherubim. And usually, if we do this in English, we just say seraphs and cherubs, because in English, the way you pluralize a word is by adding an S to the end. But in Hebrew, the way you pluralize a word is by adding IM to the end. So one cherub, two cherubim. One seraph, two seraphim. So seraphim is the plural of seraph, cherubim is the plural of cherub. Now when you hear the word cherub, what do you think of?
Angel.
Little baby angels, right?
A plump one.
Yeah, a plump little baby angel, which is totally unbiblical. Okay? Nothing in the Bible anywhere remotely like that. We've just read the biblical descriptions of cherubim and seraphim, but you say, well now wait a minute, the one in Ezekiel doesn't match the one in Revelation, and doesn't even necessarily match the one in Isaiah either. That's because they aren't meant to be literal physical descriptions. They're symbolic descriptions. They're symbolic descriptions of things. We say, well, oh, they look really cool. And oh, they're covered with eyes. Ugh, you're not supposed to paint these. You're supposed to hear each portion and go, oh, they see everything. Oh, they're swift like the eagle, or strong like the ox, or fierce like the lion, or wise like the human. It's all symbolism. It's not literal. And you know, I probably have said that 20 times now, but that's the mistake we make when we read a book like Revelation. You know, but it would be the same mistake as if reading that portion of Song of Solomon and then painting a picture of a woman who had goats for hair and deer for breasts and, you know, all these other things, and her neck looked like a tower that you built with bricks. I mean, and you would go, that's the ugliest woman I ever saw. And she's supposed to be the most beautiful woman you ever saw. That's because you're taking a symbolic description and you're trying to make it a literal description. In the same way with the description of the seraphim and the cherubim. They're not meant to be photographs. They're meant to share a message about wisdom or power or grace or swiftness. And the point is not really what they look like nearly as much as the point is that the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures that surround the throne of God, who you can't even describe him other than he's shining and bright, that what they do continually is worship. What they do continually is worship the one on the throne. And the 24 elders, it says, are wearing crowns, and they fall to their knees and bow low to the ground and put their crowns, take off their crowns and put their crowns in front of the throne, which is the way in an Eastern civilization, that would be when one king would subject himself to a greater king, that's what he would do. He would literally present his crown, lay his crown down and kneel before the mightier king. So,
Maybe that's where the idea of tipping your hat,
well,
you know?
I don't know, possibly.
Okay.
But this vision, now that we've gotten to, and we've gotten through 4 chapters now, but this vision is meant to say this: if you're a persecuted Christian living in, Philadelphia, your life is really difficult, this image of heaven and the power and majesty of God is meant to encourage you and lift you up. It's not so much to fulfill a curiosity about what does it look like. It is meant to inspire you to go, our God is a great and powerful and mighty and majestic God surrounded with worship and praise. And if you're in the same way, the message to the Babylonian captives that Ezekiel is saying, God is not dead. God is not gone. God is still in his heaven. God is still powerful and mighty. You're not going to exile forever. That's Ezekiel's image of heaven. John's vision of heaven to the persecuted church is God is high and lifted up. God is on his throne, and you don't need to lose heart. And most of this book, see, that's why I say so many people, this book, I've gone through, from this book, from being puzzled by it to being fascinated by it for all the wrong reasons, thinking it's a roadmap to what's China really about? What's Russia really about? What's the common market really about? Is credit cards the mark of the beast? You know, to all of that nonsense, to realizing this book is primarily about how did this letter encourage the persecuted church. That's the purpose of this letter, to encourage the persecuted church. Now, it may have other deeper meanings, and it does talk about the consummation of history. It does talk about how things eventually will end. Guess what? You don't have to give away the ending, but God wins. I mean, God wins, evil loses. That's the ending of the book. But it's much more about telling the first century church, who was living under horrible persecution, God is still God, and you don't need to lose heart. So we'll pick up with chapter 5 next time. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for always loving us and caring about us and encouraging us when we feel down as well. We thank you for this book that is difficult and yet also inspiring, and we pray that you'd help us as we delve into it.